Good afternoon, everybody.
مساء الخير.
Once again to the World Economic Forum. My name is Hadley Gamble. I am CNBC's senior international correspondent and anchor based in the Middle East, and I'm thrilled to be joined by this esteemed panel of guests, Your Highness, Your Excellencies. Thank you so much for joining us today. One of the things, obviously, that we want to focus on in the next 45-ish minutes, and I may push it a little bit further out, fair warning to everyone, is the new security architecture of the region. And I want to take just a moment and ask the panelists to think about a little bit more broadly what we're seeing happening in the world today. Briefly, if you could tell me, yes or no, whether you believe that the West's handling of the Ukraine crisis is going well. Yes or no? Your Highness, I'll start with you.
So we're diplomats and we never give yes or no answers. You know that.
But I have to try.
So I applaud you for trying, but like all complex situations, this one also has nuance. So it is a very complex situation. It's an important point in world history. And I don't think we can judge all of it now. What we need to do is work towards addressing all of the challenges that arise from this crisis. And they are not just the immediate challenges related to the suffering in Ukraine, but they are also challenges related to the world economy, food security, etc. And it goes well beyond that, including how do we maintain trust and faith in the world system. And that's not just about a response to what's happening in Ukraine. It's also how we have a dialogue about these things. And you know, we had a very interesting conversation earlier. I was part of it. You know, one of the panelists mentioned that that some of the Western companies, some of the Western countries got a response as, you know, they only talk to us now. You know, when this crisis happened, where were you before? And I think, especially in the developing world, you're going to have that response. So I think it's important that we continue to work on a strong dialogue to address not just this crisis, but others. Sorry, that's not a yes or no answer.
Your Excellency.
Well, thank you so much. But, you know, as His Highness Prince Faisal said, we are diplomats. So yes and no answer, I don't think that it goes along with our job criteria. But, you know, just to put it in another angle as well, it should be a holistic approach as well. We should look at everything that happened on the aftermath, 77 years of United Nations that created in the usher of a devastation of World War II, and the new structure of maintaining international law that would be a principal guidance to not to succumb further into chaos as it happened pre-World War II. If we go and see with all of the crisis in the world, but especially in the region, and especially with the Palestinian crisis, where we see that there is a flagrant violation of international law. So it should be a holistic way of maintaining international law and not to go and further violating UN United Nations Charter.
Interesting point, and we'll come back to that. Prime Minister?
Well, I believe problems in one place doesn't usually stay in that place, especially in this case. The impact that the war has had on the rest of the world is very obvious. So you can't solve a problem by ignoring the other problems, especially that now we are all facing this food security problem. So it would be best to really look at finding comprehensive solutions to ending the war peacefully, and also to support the shortages of food that has become a major problem today in the rest of the world.
Well, after all that has been said, I think...
or not said.
Yeah, I'll just say that I think the war once again proved how vulnerable our global system is, that one crisis in one place will have repercussions that will reverberate way beyond its immediate neighborhood. That is something that we've lived with in the Middle East for decades. I think the question now is what lessons are learned, how are we going to mitigate against the consequences of this crisis worsening, how do we learn from this crisis to make sure that we employ, again, one yardstick and holistic approaches to crises, so that we just don't continue to live with status quo politics for as long as their repercussions do not affect us. I think we need to, again, move towards solving crises not ignoring other crises because, one erupted, which we understand is a major one that needs to be addressed. But, my colleague from Kuwait spoke about the Palestinian issue. That is an ongoing conflict for decades, and where UN Charter and international law have been violated. We've got crises in Syria and Libya and Yemen that have, again, been suffering from status quo politics management for a while. And we've got the issue of refugees, which are becoming the forgotten, terrible consequence of the crisis
Unless they're
of the region.
Ukrainian.
I'm sorry?
Unless they're Ukrainian.
Well, I mean, again, you've got to provide Ukrainian refugees with the dignified life that they deserve. They're like every other refugee, deserve to be supported and not abandoned to need and fear and bitterness. But you've got Palestinian refugees. UNRWA continues to suffer from chronic deficits year in, year out. Syrian refugees, we as a country that hosts 1.3 million Syrians, are feeling firsthand the impact of less attention and less support for them. So again, we're a vulnerable, global system. We do better if we work together, if we work holistically, and I think that should be the message learned.
So not quite yes or no. But thank you, gentlemen, for that. Your Highness, I want to ask you about this within the context of the energy crisis that we're all living in today. Obviously, higher oil prices for a time, good for GCC nations, oil-producing nations, but now we're entering a period whether we may see demand destruction has become a big question. I want to ask you specifically about a rumor that we've seen across the press in various publications that U.S. President Joe Biden will be meeting in the very near future with His Royal Highness Mohammed bin Salman. Can you confirm whether that meeting is going to take place?
Well, I wouldn't address rumors on this stage, Hadley, and I'm sure you didn't expect me to do so. But if there is a visit in the future at any time, it would be announced through the normal diplomatic channels. So I have nothing to say or to add to that.
Interesting. And there is also a conversation that's happening about the potential for Saudi Arabia and Israel to normalize relations at the cost of some islands in between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. I wouldn't ask you to comment on rumors, but this has been reported in several publications. Do you believe that we will see in the near term a normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel?
Well, I've addressed that several times in the past, and nothing has changed in how we view the subject. I think we have always seen normalization as the end result, but the end result of a path. When the kingdom presented what is now the Arab Peace Initiative in 2001, when the kingdom presented the first initiative before that, we always envisioned that there will be a full normalization with Israel. And I've said before that a normalization between us and Israel, between the region and Israel, will bring immense benefits. But we won't be able to reap those benefits unless we are able to address the issue of Palestine and the Palestinian issue. And we've seen clear indication of that just in recent weeks and in recent months. The fact that issue remains unresolved continues to bring significant instability to the region. And I think if we don't address that issue, we will continue to empower the most extreme voices in our region to the detriment of the development path that we're on. So I think the priority now needs to be on how do we push the Palestinian-Israeli peace process forward. And if that moves forward, that can, of course, benefit all of us. It can benefit Israel and the Palestinians, but it will benefit the entire region and will open the door for others to normalize.
Have you been disappointed by the fact that the world has not pressured perhaps Israel enough over the murder of the Al Jazeera Palestinian-American journalist?
That's one incident, but the issue is more than one incident. The issue is a series of incidents and a series of confrontations that have gone without being rightly addressed. And I think we shouldn't just address individual symptoms of a problem. Let's talk about the problem. The problem is that we haven't been able to find a path to dignity for the Palestinian people. I think if we find a pathway to a state, dignity, and a pathway to hope for the Palestinian people, we won't have such incidents anymore. So that's, I think, needs to be the priority. And we have seen, I think, a lack of attention recently to this issue.
Minister Safadi, I want to bring you in on that. Was it surprising to you that the United States has dragged their feet in pushing the Israelis on an actual investigation into her murder?
Look, I mean, the murder...
Because she is an American citizen
the murder,
as well.
and she's, a Palestinian citizen, she's a journalist, and, The murder of Shirin Abu Akleh should have resonated, stronger across the whole world. I mean, after all, we're talking about a journalist doing her job, assassinated, in the course of duty. She is a well-known face to everybody. And what happened after that, I mean, the inhumane behavior at her funeral is something that just how could it, in what world should this happen and go unnoticed and not responded to? But again, I think that's one among many, many cases. Since the beginning of the year, over 42 Palestinians have been killed in clashes that have erupted across the occupied Palestinian territories. And the key issue that we should be looking at here is that there's been absolutely no political horizon for resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. That is killing hope, that is allowing the entrenchment of despair, empowering radicalism on all sides, and that's something that needs to be addressed. So I think we should go back to the drawing board and start from, we have a conflict, the answer to this conflict is the two-state solution that will end occupation, that will result in the establishment of a sovereign Palestinian state on June 4, 1967, lines with occupied Jerusalem as capital, to live in peace and security with Israel so that the potential of the region can be realized to its full. Now you do see cooperation here and there, but we all know unless you solve the problem, the key source of conflict in the region, we're going to be running back to it every time it erupts, as we saw in Jerusalem during Ramadan. So what I would warn against is complete absence of horizon, consolidation of occupation through the building of settlements, confiscation of land, eviction of people from their homes. And I represent a country that signed a peace treaty with Israel 27 years ago. So when we speak with the credibility of a peacemaker. So we speak frankly and we speak openly, and we have channels with the Israeli government, and we tell them that we all want peace. Everybody of us on the table have been pushing for the Arab Peace Initiative since 2002 to be even looked at seriously. Did not happen. And the question is, where are we going to be 5 years from here?
Yeah.
If we do not solve the conflict on the basis of the two-state solution that's being compromised day in, day out as a result of illegal measures that undermining its viability, you'll be looking at a one-state reality. And I do not say one-state solution, because one-state reality will not be a solution. It will be an ugly reality where we're going to have to be dealing with apartheid. So peace is a strategic choice for all of us. Peace is a necessity for all of us in the Arab world and in Israel, but the path to peace has been blocked for decades now, and it's about time we started. And on Shirin Abu Akleh, I mean, a very tragic loss, and a thorough investigation should be held to make sure that the murderer, the killer, is held accountable in a
Was it surprising to you that the UAE hasn't been pushing the Israelis on this as well?
The UAE
has not been pushing the Israelis.
No, I mean, look,
as well.
the UAE did take a very strong stand on that. All of us took a very strong stand against the encroachment in the Haram, into the Al-Aqsa, Al-Masjid Al-Sharif. All of us are condemned this as a murder, and all indications are, all facts are, all eyewitnesses are that she was killed by an Israeli soldier.
But should that put a halt, in your view, on the billions of dollars of infrastructure deals that are going forward now?
That should make sure that the whole world act in consistence with our declared values. What applies to Ukraine should apply to Palestine, should apply to Africa, should apply to Europe, should apply everywhere. We need a value-based and a rule-based international order, and in order for that to dig roots, it should be applied equally to all.
Yeah. Your Excellency Al-Sabah, I want to come to you now and just ask for you to perhaps comment specifically on this idea of a new security architecture for the region. Do you still believe that Saudi Arabia is the de facto leader of the Middle East in terms of policy? And what does it look like to you in the coming years as we battle a food security crisis, as the oil dynamic begins to shift to perhaps more carbon neutral or carbon friendly practices across the GCC countries? Are we still going to be seeing a lot of these GCC nations taking their cue from Saudi, or will they be taking their cue from the UAE?
Well, we are all members of GCC now for over 40 years, and for 4 decades that we have worked not only for prosperity in our region, but also around the world. Definitely, we were safe harbor during very treacherous times, either during the Iraq-Iran war, during the invasion of Kuwait, during the 9/11 crisis, during the economic crisis back in 2008, 2009, and even during the so-called Arab Spring. We were always, as a GCC and as a six-member state, we were always contributor for peace and security around the world. Of course, Saudi Arabia, we have the foreign minister who's here, so he can even talk better about his country, but Saudi Arabia is a major country in the GCC and in the region and in the world, and it have its toll in playing and securing the world. So we work
But there are differences of opinion
together.
between GCC nations.
I'm sorry?
The UAE and Saudi Arabia don't always align on certain questions.
I mean, he's here. I mean, he can definitely. He's just adjacent.
He doesn't want to answer me.
He's just adjacent.
That's why I'm asking.
But
feel free to weigh in, Your Highness.
But let me tell you one thing.
Go ahead.
Let me tell you. Back a year ago in Al-Ula summit, where some dark times in our history in GCC, where there was a rift, and now the rift is no longer there. And we are working, and GCC is back in the game, in world scenery, again, to put its imprint for peace and security, and a contributor for even, as you have mentioned, about the challenges now in the energy sector. Now, as you have mentioned, the energy sector, and now there is a rise of prices of energy and petrol. We are responsible countries around the world, and we work, even with OPEC Plus and even with OPEC to maintain the prices, so it can be in the benefit of the oil producer countries and also with the receivers. So we work as responsible countries around the world for the benefit of all. And let me just finalize with one thing. Now, if the oil prices are high, we recall very well during the COVID where the prices of barrel was zero. And we have taken our responsibility for that. So regardless of the fluctuations of prices, we will always be responsible in this matter.
So I'll pick up, if you don't mind. I would say I think the GCC is more relevant than ever.
Yeah.
I think we see, with all of the turbulence going around the world, that it's very important to have a unified position. And in our region especially, the GCC is one of the few functioning mechanisms that continue. We have a very strong mechanism to build consensus within the GCC. We are improving that mechanism. And we have seen, I think, in the last few months, a very, very strong, after the Ula summit especially, working towards building unified positions, whether it's on issues like Afghanistan and other areas where we as GCC states have focused on addressing international challenges in a unified way. We have a very strong consultative process within the GCC that helps deliver a unified position and response.
But there are differences of opinions on
Sure.
places like Libya, for example.
There are always
You see
differences.
very conflicting narratives there.
I don't know about conflicting narratives, but there are differences of opinion. There are differences of opinion in any bloc. I mean, you cannot have a group of nations
Yes, but when you're sending and putting weapons on the ground on opposing sides in the same country, in an oil-producing nation, thereby potentially upending energy markets as well, one has to wonder.
Yeah, I mean, that's your characterization, but
Is it?
It is definitely your characterization. I would say that when it comes to Libya, when it comes to other the GCC as a whole, and my impression is of the member states are focused on helping the Libyans come to a stable situation. We have seen significant progress recently that has now, unfortunately, been somewhat backtracked by the fact that we have two competing governments, and I hope that that can be addressed.
Weaponized and financed by...
Look, Libya has its own access to finance, so I don't think that's really the factor. But let's not focus on Libya. I think we have to have a focus on the fact that we as GCC states are trying to deliver a much more stable, much more secure region that can also help serve the stability of the global community. And here, I think the GCC have played historically and are playing now a very, very responsible role. It includes issues of energy security, but goes well beyond that. And we have contributed even in the response to COVID-19. The GCC states were very much in the forefront, whether it's in debt relief for developing nations, whether it's in financing the distribution of vaccines to developing nations. All of these issues, we have been on the forefront. So the GCC has delivered of great value to its member states, but also to the international community, and I'm confident that it will continue to do so.
When we spoke just a few months ago at the G20 summit in Rome, I asked you about Iran and the progress on the JCPOA agreement. And there is a great deal of concern amongst many of the folks that I speak to that the Biden administration will be willing to get a deal at any price in order to offset what we're seeing happening in the energy markets. Is that a concern for Saudi Arabia? And do you still consider Iran to be the greatest threat to stability in the region, in the broader Middle East?
So in Saudi Arabia, and I think it's the same in the other GCC states, we are very much focused, Vision 2030 and other elements, on delivering a vision of the future that is built on hope, that is built on prosperity, that is built on development, that is built on cooperation. And this is a message that, as I say, we in Saudi Arabia, but also the other GCC states who all have their individual visions for the future that are very much in that same vein, are trying to send to our region, including to our neighbors in Iran. Our hands are stretched out. We are trying to send the message that going into a new era of cooperation in the region can deliver benefits for all of us. Now, that does need a decision. It needs a decision in Iran to sign on to that vision of a much more prosperous, cooperative future. Can that happen? We are in dialogue. All of the GCC states have a strong, active dialogue with Iran. We coordinate very closely on that dialogue. We talk to each other about it. And we have made some progress, but not enough. We continue to encourage our neighbors in Iran to lean into what can be a very, very important sea change in our region. Now, of course, JCPOA, if it happens, will be potentially a good thing if it's a good deal. But for us, it's most important that we address the holistic issues, nuclear non-proliferation, regional activity, and that can be done, but it needs a sincere desire to look to the future rather than the past.
Speaking of holistic, were you pleased with the results of the election in Lebanon? Do you feel that Hezbollah lost ground?
So, I mean, in the end, this was a decision by the Lebanese people. We have said in the past that our vision or our view is that Lebanon needs to make a change. How they make that change is up to the people of Lebanon.
Looked pretty holistic.
This may be a strong indication of moving the future, but it's dependent on what decisions are taken by the political leadership in Lebanon. Are they going to, similar to what I just said, are they going to look to the future? Are we going to have real reform, real economic? Lebanon needs very, very important economic reforms. Are we going to see that? Are we going to see real political reform that reimposes the authority of the state, that brings back the legitimacy of state institutions, combats corruption in a real, sincere way? Is that going to happen? We hope it does. We will support that if it does. But right now, this may be a positive step, but it's too early to tell.
Prime Minister, I want to ask you specifically about the rocket attacks on your country. When you think about what happens next, you're obviously unable to defend yourselves against these Iranian attacks. Your partners here in the GCC countries are essentially saying to you, we are having ongoing conversations with folks in Tehran. What is your message to them? Can they help you in order to get yourselves out of this situation?
I think we have to look beyond just one particular incident. We have to look at the security of the region as a whole and see what's going on. Of course, these attacks are the results of the lack of understanding and sometimes the ambitions of some countries, the influence in the affairs of other countries. And also, in the elections that we had last October in Iraq, people casted their votes and they decided what kind of Iraq they want. Alliances were made, and there were, of course, as any democratic election, there are winners and losers. The winners, unfortunately, haven't been able to form the government because very uniquely, I mean, it's in Iraq, this is the only example I know in the world that unless you have 2/3 of the parliament votes, you are unable to form the government. So this attack also could be interpreted as pressure on the members of the trilateral alliance that happened between the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Sadris to withdraw from the alliance. And also it is another message that the increasing influence in the country will continue. Unfortunately, to limit such attacks, it requires collective effort by all the members in the region. And I would also go beyond that and ask for the support of the international community.
Most specifically, the United States.
The United States, Europe, and every country that has a stake and has interest in the region must also respect the sovereignty of the country. In Iraq, we are trying to regain the independency of the decision-making process in the country. And these efforts are really to make sure that the increasing influence in Iraq will continue without any changes. So all we've seen so far is just wishing and hoping for some sort of solutions, but not any major actions have been taken to put Iraq back on its right track so that it can defend itself and it can defend its sovereignty so that it won't be an open ground for missile attacks or political, let's say, influence or games between different parties, some of them being proxies and representing different agendas outside of Iraq.
Minister Safadi, I want to ask you specifically about what's happening today in Syria. You mentioned the refugee crisis, obviously, that Jordan has been dealing with now for years, not getting the help, frankly, that they deserve. Beyond that, do you believe that the normalization of ties with Bashar al-Assad that we're seeing amongst some of the members of the Middle East countries is a good thing, an inevitable, perhaps, conclusion to this crisis? And at some point, we're talking about a timeline here. Do you believe that you will ever see these Syrian refugees headed home?
Look, if we're talking about what's good, let's talk. What is not good is for the status quo to continue. And unfortunately, for the last few years, we've seen status quo politics. Syria is no longer a major headline, nor are refugees. And again, I believe the title of our session today was new security structures. And my 2 cents on that is that before we look at security structures, we need to look at the sources of threat in the region. And the continuation of crises, including the crisis in Syria and beginning with the Palestinian issue, is a major source of threat because that's impacting almost everything else. Now we have food security, now we have disruption of the supply chain, we have water challenges, energy challenges. All these are sources of threat, but among them as well are about 3 million Syrian kids of school-going age who are not going to school. And if we look at Iraq and what happened in Iraq, the generation that became Al-Qaeda is the generation that lived under the conditions of bitterness and abandonment and ignorance and no horizon. So when we look at Syria 11 years into the crisis, where are we going? Again, it's easy for somebody talking from 10,000, 5,000 miles away to, sort of look at it from a different perspective than we in the region. We have 367 kilometers of border with Syria. In the past few years, the biggest threat was terrorism, Daesh. Now the biggest threat is the smuggling of drugs into Jordan and across Jordan into Iraq and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and elsewhere. So I think the question is not normalize or not normalize. The question is, do we continue with status quo politics, which means the crisis continues to deepen, the suffering it's causing, it continues to affect more people. I believe the United Nations study was about 12 million Syrian kids are malnutritioned at this point. So we believe that we should really, again, look at the interconnectedness of everything in the region. We should, with Syria, we should accept the fact that the crisis cannot continue and we have to solve it. We all agree that the only answer is a political solution, so we should encourage that political solution. And to be honest, it's incomprehensible that everybody gets a seat on the table in Syria except for a collective Arab role when we are the most affected by it. So what we in Jordan have been calling for a while is that we need to come up with a mechanism that would allow us Arabs to play a collective role in efforts to bring about political crisis to the Syrian people and bring back the focus in relation to Syria to be about Syria and the Syrian people rather than it being a battlefield for competing regional and global agenda. And the same thing applies for everything else. So I think it's about time we in the region took control of our own issues, worked together, and started addressing them in ways that are conducive to solving crises and creating better futures that we all seek for our people, and allow all of us to pull all our resources as neighbors, as brotherly countries, as to work as a team, really, to be able to address all those challenges, because they're interconnected. I spoke of drugs. The first stop for drugs is Jordan. If they make it through Jordan, Saudi Arabia is going to have to be dealing with them. Yeah. And the same thing from Saudi, they'll go to Kuwait, to Iraq, to elsewhere. So we need to look at that. And again, that brings me to Lebanon. And I think the bottom line is Lebanon should not be allowed to collapse. I mean, ultimately, it's up to the Lebanese to take, again, to fix their situation. We have the new elections now, which produce different results, but still allowed for a very complex kind of situation. But ultimately, Lebanon is on the verge of collapse. And if it collapses, we all are going to pay the price in terms of security, in terms of refugees, in terms of a country that was once a beacon of enlightenment in the region is falling into the dark. So we need to look at that and see what we can do as a region to help. Iraq, again, Iraq is central to the stability and of the region. It has come a long way from the war and the Daesh control. It defeated Daesh with tremendous sacrifices. Now, what is the next step? We need to help Iraq stabilize. We need to help Iraq mitigate against interferences in its own affairs, and because we will all pay the price. So I think if we talk about any security structure to the region, I think it should start from a clear baseline where we identify sources of threat and see how we can all work together into them, taking into a fact that some of it we can solve on our own, some of it will require the cooperation of our partners and neighbors, and that's something we're all trying to do.
Your Highness, I want you to weigh in on that one, because first question would be, would a man who has been referenced as the butcher be welcome in Saudi Arabia? And I'm talking about Bashar al-Assad. And also, a little bit more broadly, His Excellency was mentioning the collapse of a sovereign state, which is, of course, Lebanon. Should it be allowed to collapse, what would Saudi Arabia be willing to give to ensure that that doesn't happen?
So state collapse is, of course, a concern, and we have to work to avoid it in our region, elsewhere. But as His Excellency mentioned, in the first instance, it's up to the people of Lebanon. It's up to the political leadership of Lebanon to take the hard decisions that can help avert that collapse, because there are real reforms that can take place that can avert that collapse. And if those reforms take place, we will look at what is potentially within our sphere of capacity, and others, I'm sure, will do the same. I will just concur with Ayman on the issue of Syria. I think status quo is not viable, and we do need to find a way forward. We need to find a way towards pushing forward the political process that has been stalled for a long time. We need to find a way to address the issue of refugees that is not just a human sacrifice to those Syrian civilians and the education of the young generation, but it's also a significant threat in Lebanon. Part of what's contributing to the potential state collapse is the burden of the Syrian refugee population. Jordan, has given a huge sacrifice in hosting the number of refugees that it's hosting. Other countries in the region are doing the same. So we need to find a way to address it. Pretending that the problem isn't there, pretending that the current way of addressing it might work, is not an answer.
Yeah.
So what's the approach? I think that's
if the price of that is inviting him to Riyadh, would you be willing to do that?
I mean, that's an oversimplification. Just because it's not just...
But the conversation has to start.
Sure, but it doesn't start there. It starts more about, what's the Arab role? What's the engagement that works? What's the potential to push the conversation forward?
But it's been years now. I would have assumed that you guys would be already on that page.
If I may just add on, look, I mean, we all have a benchmark when it comes to solving the crisis. It's resolution 2254. We need to start looking into it. We need to engage. Doubling down on scenarios that have gotten us nowhere are not going to help. What do we do? Now what we're seeing, complete stalemate, situation worsening, the people that are, supposedly all of us are there to protect us.
But it's been a bad situation that's been
are
worse
suffering
a long
more.
time.
But that's what I'm saying. It's about time we addressed it, and we cannot double down on approaches that did not work. We have to be creative, and we have to put Syria, the interest of Syria and the Syrian people first. I'll give you one example. In Jordan, 50% of Syrian refugees are under the age of 15. It means they don't know their country. Are they going back anytime soon? Isn't it our duty to create conditions conducive for them to go back? What is, even from a moral perspective, what's more immoral? To continue with the situation as it is, with all the suffering and agony that is producing, or to try and say, let's engage, stop it, and at least for now, stop the agony, stop the suffering, and work together for creating conditions that would not allow for this to happen in the future. So we're dealing with reality here. And again, as you mentioned earlier, attention to refugees is fading.
Yeah.
World Food Program is cutting subsidies to over almost 300, 400,000 Syrians in Jordan. That means we're going to have to foot the bill. Already, our economy is suffering under unemployment, 25% on average, and we've given work permits to about 300,000 Syrians. Already, we have 133,000 Syrian kids in our formal educational system. And so where do we go from here? So I think we all know that Syria has the crisis has to end. We all know that there's only a political path, and engagement is the only way, benchmarked engagement that is, benchmarked against set of principles that we all believe in and set of targets that we all want to achieve, and we start that political engagement. Otherwise, if somebody has a better alternative on the table, let them put it and discuss it with us, and we're always open to any discussion that makes sense.
Prime Minister, I want to ask you specifically about what's happening today in Baghdad. Obviously, there are a lot of questions about Iraq oil, Iraq's Kurdistan oil, and what that will actually mean with this new law that's come into play. But I want to ask you specifically, we were talking about the political issues there. So often, the narrative has been over the last several years that the danger in the region is this reach of a Shia crescent, and we're talking about reaching from Tehran through Baghdad into Lebanon, for example, and the fear that GCC countries again and again showed me in conversations in the past about what that could potentially mean for the security of the broader Middle East. How worried should we be today?
When you look at the security of Iraq and everything that we've been talking about so far, whether it's oil, whether it's before ISIS or Al-Qaeda, we have to look at the reasons why these problems emerge in the first place. In Iraq, if you look at the whole situation, there have been many wrong political decisions that have led to the creation of these sorts of problems, including the oil crisis that we have today. Neglecting and not respecting the Constitution is one of the reasons. Poverty, let's say injustice, inequality, and bad decisions, bad governance in the country has led to the rise of many of these problems.
But that bad governance, so much of it is a result directly of, frankly, Baghdad being held hostage to Tehran.
So if I may continue, one of the reasons is that I said it in the beginning, that I don't think Iraq really is sovereign in making its own decisions. It's very heavily influenced by outsiders, by external factors. And when many of the Iraqi friends are leaving Iraqis to make their own decisions, that doesn't usually happen. The gap left behind is filled by some others. It's very important for all of the friends of Iraq to try to make sure that the Iraqis are the masters of their own destiny. When this happens, and when the Constitution is respected, which is a package of compromise amongst all the different communities in the country. Now we have the Constitution, unfortunately is ignored, and many of the articles that are very important to different communities in the country are creating these sort of problems. So ethnic cleansing, for instance, has led to many of the different communities, especially in the rural areas, to cooperate and coordinate with organizations, terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda before and then ISIS now. And even today, these political decisions that they're using the so-called federal court to pass political rulings in the name of legal institutions is not going to solve anything. In fact, Iraq has enough problems that these additional problems are going to complicate the situation.
Will your government respect that ruling when it comes to oil?
Sorry?
Will your government respect that ruling when it comes to oil and your deals with international oil companies and other governments?
No, our government, four authorities in the KRG, the presidency, the Kurdistan Regional Government, the judiciary, and also the parliament, have rejected the ruling because we think this is a political ruling. It's not a constitutional ruling. This is a court that wasn't formed and established based on the constitutional norms and ways that it was supposed to be. So this is definitely a political decision made by a so-called legal institution. So no, I mean this is not an area where we believe we can accept, because this is violating our constitutional rights. To us, constitution goes above any court ruling, and we are definitely going to abide by the constitution, respect the constitution, fulfill our duties, but also demand our rights the way they are stipulated in the constitution.
I want to bring it back to His Excellency Al-Sabah. When you think about what happens next with regards to the isolation of Russia in the world, this is a story in a sense that Kuwait has seen before, and of course I'm talking about the invasion of Iraq. We have seen in the past what it is to isolate a dictator, to implement economic sanctions. Do you believe that the West is getting it right, or are they failing to learn from history?
Well, it is not as easy as saying it's the West. What we have all agreed on is that any violation of international law, any acquiring of or changing of borders by power is rejected by the whole international community. Using force rather than using dialogue is rejected. It was rejected 70 years ago when the United Nations was established, and it's rejected now, especially in the 21st century. So in this way, we are talking about respecting sovereignty, respecting the right of each and every country to be independent in its decision-making process. This is all of the values that we have been entrenched in the whole international system to not only to safeguard the rule of law, but also to protect all of the countries that are around the world, but especially small countries such as Kuwait and other countries, not to, as I have said, to succumb to law of jungle or to succumb into chaos. So for us, it is not as easy as saying the West. We are talking about the whole structure of the whole scenery of the international community by maintaining international law and not violating it.
Minister Safadi, just to weigh in on that, I mean, you were talking about the food crisis, and that's something obviously that across the region we're all very concerned about, whether we're talking about Egypt or Jordan, Lebanon, of course. People literally are actually starving in that country at this point. 20 million tons, I'm told by the Ukrainians, of grain are stuck in their country. The Russians are stealing some of it. They're unable to get it out by ship. The Europeans are attempting to do something whereby they would be able to get that into international markets. But at this point, do you believe that when policymakers are looking at what they should be doing next with regards to Ukraine, with regards to Russia, should the entire world be held hostage, in your view, to the West's perception of what Ukraine's sovereignty should look like at the cost of people starving? Because we're talking about famine at this point in some countries.
Look, it's not about the West's perception of what's happening. We have an international order. We have a UN charter, and the global sort of system has been there for decades, and it identifies what's right and what's wrong. And you know, we stand in principle.
Do you see it as a double standard?
No,
though?
but we stand in principle against the invading of a foreign country, against violating the sovereignty of a foreign country, against violating the territorial integrity of other countries, because that's a position we've taken vis-a-vis, every other conflict. I mean, Kuwait took that position. We all took that. Palestine is an ongoing issue. So we have to be consistent with that. That said, we have to look beyond the immediate consequences of the crisis. I think we have yet to see the worst of the impact of the Russian-Ukrainian crisis. As you said, in terms of food security, you're looking at food commodity increases as well. You're looking at disruption of supplies. You're talking at energy prices for a country like Jordan that is totally dependent on inputs of oil. I mean, the increase in oil prices is a major, major problem with which we're going to have to grapple at a time when we're initiating, economic reforms that require, more flexibility in the market. Look at the bond market, for instance, global bond. I mean, any country who wants to go borrow money now is going to be facing a lot of challenges, and that's something that we're dealing with as well. So I think we need to look collectively at that crisis, and in addressing the consequences of the Russian war on Ukraine, we need to not just try to score points in terms of condemnation here and condemnation there. We need to take measures that make sure that they address equally the impact of this crisis on all of us. I mean, again, with view to addressing food security among oil prices, energy prices, among other issues. We were just in a session where people who know way better than me on the economy are talking about growth that's going to be very, very weak compared to inflation that we're going to be seeing.
Yeah.
We're going to be managing inflation and growth at the same time, and that's going to be difficult without having the tools to do so. So all these are problems, and again, the interconnectedness of our globe needs to be sort of acted upon more practically in terms of making sure that everybody gets a fair chance in terms at dealing with those challenges. So it's not really a question of a perception here, a perception there. There is a reality. The reality is this war is going to affect all of us, and the reality is all of us need to work together in order to be able to address it. And then again, in our region in particular, I think all of us are realizing more and more the importance of us coming together to address common challenges and to maximize, sort of value on whatever we do in terms of energy, water, resources, environment. We're so close. Sometimes people do not understand that the distance between Damascus and Amman is less than 250 kilometers. So we're one region, and I think the good news from the region is that, again, what His Majesty has been referring to is that we're all more cognizant now of the need for us to come together and work together. Again, to try and mitigate against the consequences of those crises on us. So it's work in progress, but next year is going to be tough. This year is already tough, and we cannot afford, again, more failed states in our region. Back to your point about Lebanon, if Lebanon fails, what are the consequences?
Yeah.
Look at Yemen. I mean, the suffering of the Yemeni people and the efforts to bring about a political solution to it, and we all know what the road to that is. But it's, again, look at the broader picture.
Your Highness, I wanted to leave it with you in this question, which is one which has frankly seemed to baffle those sitting in the White House for many, many months now. Is there anything that the Biden White House could offer Saudi Arabia today that would change your view on oil production, would get more oil into the market?
Look, I am not the I'm not the energy minister, so it's not something.
I'm very aware, but as we know, energy security is national security.
Energy security is national security, but it's a question that it's very difficult to address in such a short sphere, because it's much more complex than just bringing.
I have all the time that you need.
No, but joking aside, it's much more complex than just bringing barrels to the market, because we know, first of all, that the gas situation is much more dire than the oil situation. Our assessment is that actually oil supply right now is relatively imbalanced. There are no significant, as far as we are aware, there's no shortfall of oil. The problem is in refined products, which is something that is more connected to a lack of investment over the last year and a half, 2 years in refining capacity than bringing barrels now to the market. And then there is an issue in the gas markets, and that's something bringing more oil to the market will not address. And most important is that we can't talk about energy with short-termism. We have to understand that in order for us to meet the global growth targets that we have, especially with the pressure we are under, we have to take a holistic approach. That means addressing climate change and the transition towards a new green economy in a way that is reasonable and sensible and that is in accordance with the interests of not just a small number of countries, but the global community. And that means that we have to be sure that while we transition to a renewable future, there is enough energy in the market. The Kingdom has done what it can. I would say that OPEC as a whole has done a lot to make sure that the oil markets are stable in a way that provides enough capital to invest to bring the necessary capacity online in the interim while we all transition to green energy. But unfortunately, there have been others who have called for a complete stop to investment in hydrocarbons in the short term before we are ready for that. So that's, I think, an area we have to focus on.
Including the White House.
I think it's not just the White House, it's a conversation that has been dominated by the voices that have been calling for a stopping of that investment. I think my sense is that there is a better understanding of these dynamics now. It's not an easy subject, as I said, and it's best left to the energy experts to discuss. But I would say, first of all, we will always focus on making sure that oil markets are in balance on an oil side, and we have a commitment to the global community to do that, and we feel quite strongly that we have fulfilled that commitment. We will continue to do so, and we will work with our partners to address the longer-term issue of how do we manage the transition to a green economy, a green-powered economy without disruption and without undue burden on the global economy.
Your Highness, Your Excellencies, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.